The summer air in the Black Hills was a liar. It came to you warm and generous, carrying the scent of ponderosa pine and sun-baked granite, whispering of long days and easy living. It moved through the tall grass like a promise. It turned the creek water to silver and made the ridgelines glow a deep burnished amber in the long evening light. Standing in it, breathing it in, a person could almost believe that this land was kind, that it meant well, that it intended for you to survive. Mara Bevan knew better. She had arrived in the Black Hills just over a year ago with her husband Celine, a son named Owen, and a deed to 40 acres of land that a man in a St. Louis office had described as a promising homestead claim with substantial natural resources. What the deed had not mentioned, and what the man in St. Louis had almost certainly never seen, was that the substantial natural resource was granite. Ancient, unmovable, magnificent, and completely useless granite. The 40 acres were beautiful the way a painting is beautiful. You could look at it, you could admire it. You could not grow a single row of corn in it, but it was theirs. And in the fall of 1882, that had felt like enough. Celine had been a collier back in Wales, a man of the deep earth, shaped by decades of underground work in the coal mines of the Rhondda Valley. He was not a large man, but he was dense with a quiet, immovable kind of strength, the kind that comes from years of doing hard work in confined spaces without complaint. He had strong hands and a low, steady voice, and he had a way of looking at a problem, whether it was a collapsed tunnel or a difficult landlord, with a patience that bordered on the supernatural. He did not panic. He studied. He had brought that same patient intelligence to the Black Hills. He looked at the granite hill that backed their property not as an obstacle, but as a geological curiosity. He examined the creek bed, the angle of the slope, the way the afternoon light moved across the stone face. He spoke about it in the evenings, his voice still carrying the music of the Welsh valleys, even after all the years, all the miles. He had plans, good plans, the kind of plans that take time to unfold. He did not have time. The cough had started in November, 6 weeks after they arrived. It was a small thing at first, the kind of cough that comes with the first cold nights of autumn. The body adjusting to a new altitude, new air. Mara had not worried. Celine had coughed before every collier did. The coal dust lived in the lungs long after a man left the mines. It was part of the life they had always known. But this cough was different. This one had teeth. Through December and into January it deepened, changed in character, became something that shook his whole frame and left him breathless on the narrow cot they shared. By February it was bringing up blood. Not a great deal of it, not at first, but enough. Enough to tell Mara everything she needed to know about what was coming. Enough to make the winter feel like something alive and deliberate, something that had followed them across an ocean and a continent, and was now finally collecting what it was owed. Celine died on the 4th of March, 1883. He died on a morning when the temperature outside was minus 22 degrees, and the light through the single small window was the pale, exhausted gray of late winter. He died quietly, which was like him, and without complaint, which was also like him. He held Mara's hand at the end and he said something in Welsh that Owen, who was 6 years old at the time, would not understand for many years. He said the stone remembers. It always remembers. Then he was gone. What followed was a period that Mara would later be unable to fully account for. Not in the sense that she forgot it, but in the sense that memory requires a certain degree of conscious presence to form properly. And for several weeks after Selin's death, she was not entirely present. She fed Owen. She kept the fire going. She moved through the cabin and through the days like a woman walking in her sleep, performing the necessary functions of survival, while the larger part of her stood somewhere else entirely in some interior country she could not name or navigate. Owen seemed to understand this. He was 6 years old and he had just lost his father, and yet he moved around his mother with a careful, instinctive gentleness that was far beyond his years. He kept himself quiet. He did not ask for things he did not need. He watched her with eyes that held a gravity that had no business being in the face of a child. And he waited. Mara came back to herself in April, when the snow finally began to retreat from the lower meadows, and the first green things began to push up through the cold earth. She came back the way a person comes back from a very long journey, finding the familiar landscape changed in subtle but irreversible ways. She came back to a cabin that was poorly built, a piece of land that was mostly rock, a wood pile that was nearly gone, and a son who needed her to be not just present, but competent. She took stock. The cabin was the first problem, and it was a substantial one. It had been built before they arrived by a previous claimant who had given up on the land. After one winter, a fact that in retrospect should have told Mara and Selin something important. The man had built it quickly and with more attention to size than to sense. The logs were large, which was good, but the chinking between them, the material that sealed the gaps and kept the wind out, was a rough mixture of mud and dried grass that was already crumbling in several places. Mara could see daylight through 2 gaps near the eastern wall. In summer, this was merely a nuisance. She understood with a cold and unambiguous clarity what it would be in winter. The fireplace was the second problem, and in some ways it was worse. It dominated the south wall of the cabin, a massive construction of local stone that the previous owner had clearly built with a great deal of labor and a great deal of pride. It was without question impressive to look at. It was wide enough to burn 4-foot logs. The mantelpiece was a single piece of granite nearly 2 inches thick. Any man seeing it for the first time would nod with approval and say that whoever built that hearth knew what he was doing. Mara looked at it and saw a machine for losing heat. She had learned to look at things this way from Selin, who had spent his whole working life thinking about air movement and combustion and the behavior of gas and heat in confined spaces. He had explained to her on many evenings in many different ways the physics of a large open fireplace. The way it worked was simple and brutal. You built a big fire, and the big fire created a massive updraft, a column of hot air and combustion gases racing up and out of the flue. That updraft was powerful. It was, in fact, so powerful that it did not limit itself to the smoke and gases from the fire. It pulled the air from the entire room. It sucked the warmth from every corner, from every crevice, from the very atmosphere that surrounded the people who lived there. And as that warm air left, physics demanded that something fill its place. What filled its place came from outside, cold air. Dense, heavy Arctic cold air, seeping in through every gap and crack in the walls, drawn in by the relentless vacuum created by the very fire that was supposed to keep it out. You fed the fire, and the fire fed the cold. That was the bargain a conventional fireplace offered. And it was a terrible one. You could keep a small circle of air warm the few feet directly in front of the flames. But the rest of the room, the corners, the floor, the far wall where the beds were, those remained cold. And the cost was enormous. The amount of wood required to maintain even that limited warmth through a Black Hills winter was, Mara had calculated with careful, frightened arithmetic, more than she could possibly cut and haul and stack by herself. She had a 7-year-old son. She had an axe. She had a wood pile that would last at current consumption perhaps 6 weeks. The neighbors had noticed her situation. Of course they had. In a settlement this small, everyone's situation was visible to everyone else. And the situation of a Welsh widow with a small child and an inadequate wood pile was the kind of thing that attracted a particular quality of attention. Not cruel attention mostly. These were not cruel people. But they were people who had a great deal to worry about for their own survival. And the assessment they made of Mara Bevan was practical and swift. She was a liability, a problem that would require the community's resources if she did not solve it herself. And the evidence suggested she was not capable of solving it herself. The wood piles of her neighbors grew through the summer like living things. She watched them from a distance. She watched the men work the rhythmic crack of axes, the heavy percussion of logs, splitting the growing stacks of cordwood that rose beside each cabin like brown monuments to the coming season. It was hard, relentless work, and they did it with a kind of grim, focused energy that she recognized and respected. They understood what was coming. They had lived through it before. They were not taking chances. They looked at Mara's wood pile, which was small and growing slowly, and their expressions were not unkind, but they were not warm either. There was pity in those looks. And there was something harder underneath the pity. A judgment. She is not gonna make it. Not with that pile. Not alone. They were right. And she knew they were right. And that knowledge was its own kind of cold. She was not lazy. She worked every hour of light that the summer gave her here. And the summer in the Black Hills was generous with its light, the days stretching long and gold into the evening. She cut wood. She hauled water. She repaired what she could of the chinking in the cabin walls, pressing new mud into the gaps with her fingers and smoothing it flat, knowing that some of it would shrink and crack as it dried and need to be done again. She tended a small garden on the only patch of her property that had enough soil to grow anything, and she coaxed beans and turnips and a few scraggly rows of potatoes from the reluctant ground. She did all of this, and it was not enough, and she knew it. Owen helped where he could. He was 7 now, and he had grown in the months since his father's death. in ways that were not entirely about height. He was a quiet, watchful child, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. And he seemed to have inherited, along with those physical features, some portion of his father's underground patience. He did not fuss. He did not complain. He hauled small armloads of wood to the pile without being asked, and he stacked them with a care and precision that made Mara's chest ache sometimes when she watched him. He was trying to save their lives with his 7-year-old arms, and he knew it, and he did not think it was remarkable. It was August when the idea came to her. She could not have said later exactly when it happened, whether it was a single moment or a slow accumulation of moments that finally reached a critical mass. She had been standing behind the cabin in the long afternoon light, looking at the granite hill that formed the northern boundary of their property. The hill was a broad, gradual slope of ancient stone, its face interrupted here and there by the roots of ponderosa pines that had found some improbable crack in the rock and taken hold. The stone was warm under the afternoon sun, warm in a way that she could feel from 3 feet away, a radiating steady warmth that the granite had been storing all day and was now releasing slowly into the cooling air. She placed her palm flat against the stone. It was not just warm on the surface. The warmth went deep. You could feel it coming from somewhere far inside the rock, a stored energy patient and enormous. The sun had been working on this stone since morning, and the stone had accepted every calorie and held it, and was now giving it back gently and without haste into the evening air. She stood there with her hand on the warm stone, and she heard Celine's voice as clearly as if he were standing beside her. The stone remembers. It always remembers. He had said it in Welsh on the morning of his death, but he had said it in English too many times in many different forms over the years of their marriage. He had said it in the mines, explaining to young colliers why the deeper tunnels were warmer, even in the coldest winters. He had said it on the first evening they had stood on this property looking at the granite hill, his eyes moving over the stone face with that patient, assessing intelligence that had always made her trust him. That stone, he had said, has been down here since before anything we would call a name for time. It has soaked up 1,000 summers. It doesn't give that up easy. She stood with her palm against the warm granite, and she thought about heat. Not about fire, not about wood. About heat itself, about what it was and how it behaved, and what happened to it when a fire burned. Heat was not fire. Heat was the energy that fire released, and once released, it went somewhere. The question, the only question that mattered, was where. In the cabin's great wasteful fireplace, it went up. 90% of it went straight up the chimney and out into the uncaring sky, and the remaining 10% went into the room for a few minutes before the fireplace's powerful draw sucked it back out again through the walls. The stone of the fireplace itself absorbed a small amount of heat and held it for a time, but the fireplace was not large enough, not dense enough, not deep enough in thermal mass to make a significant difference. But the hill was. The hill was 40 feet deep and 100 yards wide, The hill was ancient granite that had been absorbing the energy of the sun for 10,000 years. The hill had a thermal mass that dwarfed anything a human being could build in a season or a lifetime. It was the greatest natural heat storage system she could imagine, and it was directly behind her cabin. The problem was getting the heat into it. She stood at the stone face for a long time, her palm pressed flat, her mind working with the kind of careful, systematic clarity that fear sometimes produces in people who cannot afford to panic. She was not a scientist. She had no formal education beyond what the church schools in Wales had provided, which was modest. But she was the wife of a man who had spent 30 years thinking about the behavior of rock and air and heat in underground spaces, and she had listened to him. She had listened with the attention of a woman who understood that her husband's knowledge was not abstract, that it was the knowledge of survival, and that survival was always worth paying attention to. She began to think it through. If she could build a long horizontal channel of stone running from the fireplace into the hill, a kind of underground flue, then the hot gases from the fire would not go straight up into the sky. They would be forced to travel horizontally through a long, confined stone passage before they found their way out. And as they traveled that passage, something important would happen. The heat in the gases would transfer to the stone of the channel. The laws of nature demanded it. Heat always moved from hot to cold. The hot gases pressing against the cool stone would have no choice but to surrender their thermal energy to give it up to the rock calorie by calorie, foot by foot, all along the 40-foot journey to the chimney on the far end. And the stone would remember. It would store that heat slowly, steadily over hours of burning. It would store it in the tunnel walls, in the clay and soil surrounding the tunnel, and in the granite of the hill itself. And then, long after the fire had died, long after the last ember had gone cold, the stone would begin to give it back. Not in a sudden rush, not in the wasteful, violent way that a conventional fireplace threw heat at a room. Slowly, gently, steadily. The way a summer stone releases its warmth into a cool evening. The way the deep rock of a mine stays constant while the world above freezes and thaws. She would not be heating the air in the cabin. She would be heating the cabin itself. The floor, the back wall, the very foundation of the structure. She would make them warm and warm. Things stay warm. And warm things warm. The air around them without effort and without waste. She stood at the stone face until the light was going, and Owen called to her from the cabin door, his voice thin and clear in the evening air. She turned and looked at him, small and precise in the doorway, and she made a decision that she understood even in that moment would define everything that followed. She was going to dig. She spent 3 days thinking through every detail she could anticipate before she picked up a single tool. This was Selen's method, and it had been the method of every good miner she had ever known. You did not go into the earth unprepared. You thought it through on the surface where mistakes were merely embarrassing before you went below where mistakes could kill you. The firebox would need to be rebuilt first. The existing fireplace was the wrong design entirely, a wide-open, inefficient furnace optimized for making a visible, impressive fire, at the expense of every principle of good combustion. She needed something different, a small, tall, tightly enclosed firebox that would burn hot and fast, that would create a complete combustion of the wood and produce the minimum amount of smoke and the maximum amount of heat. A firebox that would generate the intensely hot gases she needed to force through the 40-foot tunnel gases hot enough to have real thermal energy to surrender along the journey. The tunnel itself would need to be lined with flat stone smooth on the inside to allow the gas to move freely tight enough to keep the gases in contact with the stone walls, ensuring maximum heat transfer. It would need to be stable. It would need to be shored up at regular intervals with timber. The way Selin had taught her a mine tunnel should be shored to distribute the weight of the earth above and prevent collapse. It would need to be exactly level or tilted slightly upward toward the chimney to assist the natural buoyancy of the hot gases, their tendency to rise. The chimney at the far end would need to be tall enough, 20 feet she calculated, tall enough to create the draw, the suction that would pull the cooled gases up and out and keep the whole system flowing. A chimney that was taller than the firebox opening, taller than any possible path the gases might take backward into the cabin, so that the path of least resistance was always forward, always through the tunnel, always toward the open air. She drew it in the dirt behind the cabin. She drew it again on a scrap of cloth with a bit of charcoal. She lay in her cot at night and walked through it in her mind, following the path of the hot gas from the firebox, through the tunnel to the chimney, looking for problems, looking for the place where it would fail. She found one potential failure point that kept her awake for 2 nights. Smoke was buoyant. It was lighter than cold air, and it would always prefer to rise rather than travel horizontally. Forcing smoke to travel 40 feet horizontally before it could rise was asking it to do something contrary to its nature. And every practical builder she could imagine, Harlan Voss or any man of similar certainty and experience, would say that it simply would not do it, that it would find the shorter path, that it would come back into the room. She thought about this for a long time. The key, she decided, was the temperature of the gases. If she could make the firebox hot enough, truly hot, the gases leaving it would have enormous buoyancy. They would press forward with real force, driven by the pressure of the fire behind them and by their own desperate need to rise and expand. A sufficiently hot, fast-moving gas in a well-sealed horizontal channel would travel 40 feet without difficulty because it would not be traveling on its belly. It would be traveling under pressure, like water through a pipe. And at the far end of the 40-foot pipe was a 20-foot vertical chimney, taller than anything else available to it, offering the most powerful draw in the system. The gas would go there. It would go there because that was the most attractive exit available. And hot gases, like most things, take the path of greatest opportunity. She thought about the draw carefully. The vertical chimney would work because the gases arriving at its base, even after surrendering a great deal of their heat to the stone of the tunnel, would still be warmer than the outside air. That temperature difference, even a modest one, was all that was needed to produce an upward draft. The gases would rise, and as they rose, they would pull the next rush of hot gas from the firebox behind them, keeping the whole system in a continuous self-sustaining flow. It would work. She was as certain of this as she had been of anything in her life, with the possible exception of the morning she had decided to marry Celine Bevan, whom she had known for 11 days, and who had proposed to her at the bottom of a coal shaft, because he had wanted to ask her where she would be least likely to run away. She had not run then. She would not run now. She began to dismantle the fireplace in the last week of August. It was harder than she had anticipated, which itself was something she had anticipated and had still underestimated. The stones that made up the hearth were large, some of them weighing more than she could lift alone, and they had been set with the kind of crude permanence that characterized everything the original builder had done. There was no finesse in the construction, no thought for the possibility that the structure might one day need to be taken apart. The stones were heavy and irregular, and wedged against each other at angles that made removing one without disturbing 3 others a puzzle of considerable difficulty. Owen helped. He could not lift the large stones, but he could help lever them with a length of timber, while Mara provided the main force, and he could haul the smaller pieces away from the work area in his arms, carrying them outside and stacking them with the precision she had seen him bring to the woodpile. He worked without complaint and without drama, his small face set in concentration, his breath coming hard when the work demanded it. It took 4 days to clear the firebox to the point where the back wall of the hearth, the wall that abutted the hillside, was accessible. On the 5th day, Mara picked up Selin's pickaxe. She had kept it oiled and sharp since his death, as she had kept all his tools not out of sentiment but out of respect, because they were good tools and good tools should be maintained. She drove the pick into the hillside. The earth resisted. Of course it did. The ground here was a mixture of dense clay packed around rocks of various sizes, decomposed granite that was somewhere in character between soil and stone, and the occasional unmovable boulder that announced its presence, with a jarring shock up the handle that traveled from her palms to her shoulders. The work was not elegant. It was not fast. It was the kind of work that can only be done by someone who has removed from her mind the concept of how long it will take and has replaced it with the simpler, more manageable concept of the next swing. She swung. She moved the loosened material with a short-handled shovel into a bucket. Owen dragged the bucket to the entrance of the forming tunnel and tipped it into a growing pile of excavated earth outside the cabin. They had established this rhythm by the end of the first hour, and they maintained it through the long, hot days of early September, with a steadiness that had nothing in it of inspiration or momentum and everything in it of simple, necessary persistence. The town noticed. In a settlement of 30-odd families spread across a few square miles of Dakota hillside, news traveled the way all news travels in small communities without effort and without mercy. Within a week of Mara beginning her excavation, everyone who lived within a day's ride knew that the Welsh widow was doing something strange. The characterizations varied based on the speaker's temperament. Some said she was building a root cellar in the wrong place. Some said she had cracked under the weight of her grief and was doing something that made no sense to anyone who asked. A few, the more charitable ones, suggested she might have a plan that they did not yet understand. Most, when they learned the full scope of it, a 40-foot tunnel from the fireplace into the hillside, fell back into the first two categories with renewed conviction. It was Harlan Voss who came first. Harlan Voss was a man who had built more structures in the Black Hills than any other living person, a record he was aware of and proud of in the way that a craftsman is proud of real earned achievement. He was not a tall man, but he had the kind of physical presence that tall men often lack. A density of manner, a heaviness of authority that filled whatever space he occupied. He wore his certainty the way he wore his coat, as though it were a natural extension of himself. Something he had been born with, rather than developed. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early September, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth around the excavation site. He stood for a long time watching Mara emerge from the shallow beginning of the tunnel, dragging a full bucket behind her, her hair dark with sweat, her arms and dress covered in the red-brown clay of the hillside. He said nothing until she straightened and looked at him, wiping her face with the back of her hand and leaving a streak of mud across her cheek that she did not bother to remove. "Mistress Bevan," he said. His voice was accustomed to being listened to, and it showed. "Mr. Voss," she said. He looked at the tunnel entrance, at the demolished back wall of the hearth, visible through the cabin door, at the growing pile of excavated earth. He was a man who assessed things quickly and had developed over 30 years of building a quick and generally accurate instinct for structural problems. He assessed this problem quickly. "What are you building?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was not entirely sure he wanted to know. "A flue," she said. He looked at her steadily. "A flue," he repeated. "Running from the firebox back into the hill, 40 feet, with the chimney at the far end." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that precedes a verdict. "The smoke won't make the journey," he said. "It will turn back. It will fill this room with smoke and you will suffocate in your beds. You understand this, you and the boy. Smoke is lighter than cold air," Mara said. "It prefers to climb. I am giving it a long road to walk before it can climb, and I am making the far end of the road more attractive than the short path back." Something shifted in Harlan Voss's face. Not quite anger. Something more like the expression of a man who has found an error in a calculation that he expected to be correct. "You are asking smoke to travel 40 feet on its belly," he said. "It won't do it. The physics won't support it. The physics will support it if the gases are hot enough, and the draw is sufficient." He stared at her. She looked back at him with an evenness that she had spent considerable effort constructing over the past weeks, an evenness that cost her more than it appeared to cost. "Mistress Bevan," he said, and his voice dropped into the register of a man explaining something important to someone who does not fully understand the stakes. "I am telling you this with no unkindness intended. I have been building in this territory for 11 years. I have seen people lose their homes, lose their livestock, lose their lives because they went into a Black Hills winter without proper heat. What you are proposing is not just inadequate. It is dangerous. The smoke will come back into this room. and if it does not kill you directly, the cold will, because you will have destroyed the only functional heating system you have. The system I have, Mara said, will consume more wood than I can cut before January. And wood I do not have is as useful to me as smoke that does not travel. He had no immediate answer to this. I will send men to help with your wood pile, he said after a moment. We look out for our own here. You are one of our own, whatever you may think. It was a generous offer. She understood that, and she was not unmoved by it. But she heard in it what he intended, that the men would help her do things the right way. And the right way was the way that everyone else was doing it. The right way was what he understood and approved of. The help came with a condition, which was that she abandon what she was doing and return to the conventional path. I am grateful, she said, but I will keep digging. His face closed. Then I cannot help you, he said, and I would be lying if I told you I believed you would survive the winter. I hope I am wrong. He turned and walked back toward town, and Mara watched him go. She stood in the afternoon sun for a long moment after he disappeared over the rise. Then she picked up the bucket and went back into the tunnel. The conversation with Harlan Voss, delivered to the community with his characteristic authority, had a clarifying effect on the town's opinion of Mara Bevan. The few who had been uncertain what to make of her project now had Voss's assessment to guide them, and Voss's assessment was unambiguous. She was beyond help. She had been offered the sensible path and refused it. What happened next was her own doing. The community, as communities do when a member proves unwilling to be helped, released her. Not cruelly, not with hostility, simply with the kind of quiet withdrawal that says, we have done what we can. Whatever comes now is not our responsibility. Mara felt the withdrawal as a change in the quality of the air when she walked to the general store. It was in the way conversations shifted when she entered a room. It was in the glances that slid past her, rather than meeting her eyes. She had gone from being a problem to be managed to a conclusion that had already been reached. She was no longer a widow who might need help. She was a lesson in the making. She kept digging. October came, and the aspens on the hillsides turned a brilliant, heartbreaking yellow, and the nights began to carry a different quality of cold. Not the manageable chill of early autumn, but something with an edge to it, something purposeful. The first hard frosts arrived without ceremony. The garden was done. The creek ran slower and darker. The birds that had filled the mornings with noise through the summer went quietly away. Mara worked by lantern light in the mornings before dawn, and by lantern light again in the evenings. The tunnel extended foot by foot into the hillside, a dark, cramped passage, just wide enough for her shoulders and just tall enough barely for her to move on her hands and knees, with a lantern held before her. She lined the walls and floor with flat stones from the creek bed, stones she and Owen gathered on the days when the digging had produced enough material for a rest. Owen carried them in a wooden sledge she had built from spare lumber, pulling it up the path from the creek with a rope over his small shoulder, his breath making clouds in the cool air. She shored the roof of the tunnel with timber every 5 feet, just as Selin had taught her. Cross beams of pine, notched and fitted, braced against the walls, and supporting a lattice of smaller branches above them to distribute the weight of the earth. It was meticulous work, and it was correct work, and as the tunnel grew longer and the darkness at the far end extended further from the lantern's reach, she felt in the rightness of the structure, in the solid, honest fit of each timber and each stone, something that was almost close to peace. Owen had taken to sitting at the tunnel entrance while she worked inside. He brought his whittled wooden figures, a small and serious collection of soldiers and animals that Selin had started for him and that he had continued himself with a pocket knife and a patience remarkable in a child his age. He sat cross-legged in the entrance and carved or arranged his figures on the flat ground, and he talked to her. A steady, quiet stream of observation and question and small story, a thread of sound running down the tunnel to where she worked in the dark, keeping her connected to the living world outside. He told her about the hawk he had watched circling the hill all morning. He told her about the frost patterns on the inside of the window when he had woken up. He told her that he thought the 2 rabbits that had been living under the woodshed were gone. Now probably gone south, he said, which was a thing he had heard someone say about birds, and seemed to him possibly applicable to rabbits as well. She listened to his voice, and she swung the pick, and she did not tell him how frightened she was. There was no advantage in his knowing. He was doing exactly what he needed to do, which was trust her, and she did not want to give him reason to do anything else. By the 12th of October, the tunnel was complete, 40 feet into the hillside, straight and true-lined from end to end with fitted stone. The vertical shaft at the far end was the hardest part, requiring her to excavate upward through 20 feet of earth and rock, and emerge at the surface of the hillside far enough above the cabin that the chimney she built there, a careful construction of stacked stone mortared with clay, would have a clear draw to the open air. She built the chimney low and nearly invisible, flush with the natural rock of the slope, deliberate in its modesty. She did not want it noticed. The work of rebuilding the firebox inside the cabin took another week. She designed it as she had planned it, tight and vertical. A contained chamber meant for a fast, ferociously hot burn. She sealed the old chimney flue above it with rock and clay packed so tightly that no gas could pass. She sealed it from the inside and then sealed it again from the outside, standing on a ladder in the cold October air, pressing clay into every gap with her fingers until there was nothing left to seal. Owen watched this with a particular attention. "You are closing the chimney," he said. "I am," she said. "Where will the smoke go?" "Into the hill," she said, "and then up the far chimney." He thought about this for a moment with the serious, methodical concentration that had always characterized him. "Will it go?" he asked. "Not will it work. Just will it go?" He was asking about the smoke the way you might ask about a horse you were not sure would take a new bit. A question of willingness of nature. Mara came down the ladder and stood beside him and looked at the sealed flue. "It will go," she said. "It doesn't have anywhere else to go, and it doesn't like to stay still. Smoke always wants to go somewhere. We are just choosing where." He nodded, accepting this, and went back inside. She stood for a moment longer in the cold October air, alone with the wind moving through the pines on the slope above her, and the first gray edge of winter showing in the clouds on the northern horizon. She had built what she had planned to build. The question that remained the only question was whether the thing she had built would work. She had no way to know until she lit the first fire. The test came on the second day of November. A cold front had moved through the night before pushing the temperature down hard and leaving a skim of ice on the water bucket inside the cabin. Not a killing cold yet, not the deep structural cold that January would bring, but enough. A cold that required a fire. A cold that was in a sense an audition for the system she had built. Owen was awake before she was sitting up in his cot, with his breath making small clouds in the dark cabin air. He was already dressed. He looked at her with the gravity she had come to think of as his default expression. A look that asked no questions because the question had already been decided. He would do whatever the situation required. And he was waiting to find out what that was. She built the fire in the new firebox. She used dry pine split fine, arranged in the tight, upright fashion she had worked out for maximum early heat. She lit it with a sulfur match and a handful of dry grass, and it caught quickly the small space of the firebox, concentrating the flames and driving the heat up through the throat and into the horizontal tunnel beyond. For a long moment she stood watching the mouth of the firebox. The fire burned. The wood crackled. The flames rose and fell in the tight vertical chamber, working hard in the confined space, the way a horse works hard in a narrow canyon. And the smoke went in. It did not billow back into the room. It did not curl and pool against the ceiling. It moved forward, drawn by the pressure of the fire and by the temperature difference between the hot gases and the cool stone of the tunnel. And it disappeared into the horizontal passage with a steadiness that was deeply, quietly satisfying. Owen was watching her. She kept her face still for his sake, though what she felt in that moment was not the relief of a theory confirmed, but something older and more physical, a loosening of something in her chest that had been held tight for months. She breathed out slowly and looked at the small, clean fire burning in the firebox, and she listened to the cabin. It was silent. No roar of draft. No howl of cold air being sucked through the wall gaps. The silence of a room that was not in conflict with itself. She waited 2 hours. At the end of the 2 hours, she put the back of her hand against the stone wall behind the firebox, the wall that connected the cabin to the tunnel system running into the hill. The stone was warm, not dramatically warm, not hot, but distinctly, undeniably warm. A warmth that seemed to come from deep inside the stone, rather than from its surface. She pressed her palm to the floor. The floorboards were not cold. She sat down on the floor beside Owen, who had been watching her conduct this inspection with great seriousness, and she put her hand on the wooden boards and felt the slight but real warmth rising through them from the earth below. "Is it working?" Owen asked. She looked at him. She looked at her son, 7 years old, dressed in his single good wool shirt, sitting on the floor of the cabin they were going to survive in. "It is working," she said. He looked at the floor, then at the wall, then at the small steady fire in the firebox. He appeared to do a calculation of some kind, the same systematic accounting she had watched him apply to the woodpile and the rabbit tracks and everything else in his world. "Good," he said with the finality that closed the subject completely. He picked up his wooden soldier from the floor beside him and returned to whatever campaign he had been conducting before she sat down. Mara kept her hand on the warm floorboard. Outside, the November wind moved through the pines. The sky was the flat iron gray of deep autumn, and the first real snow of the season was building somewhere to the north, working its way down through the mountains with the patient certainty of a thing that has time on its side and knows it. Inside, the floor was warm. Inside, the stone wall radiated a quiet, steady heat that asked nothing from anyone and took nothing from the room and would still be there in the morning long after the fire in the small firebox had burned itself down to ash and gone silent. Mara Bevan sat on the warm floor of her cabin in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory in the early days of November 1883, and she thought about the hill behind her house and the 40 feet of stone tunnel running through it, full now of the heat from her fire, paying its rent to the earth that held it. And she felt something she had not felt since the 4th of March of that year. She felt certain, not certain that everything would be easy, not certain that there would be no hardships, no failures, no mornings that would require more of her than she felt she had to give, but certain of the thing that mattered most, the foundational thing, the thing upon which all other things rested. The earth would keep its promise. The stone would remember. They were going to be warm. Winter did not arrive in the Black Hills. It invaded. There was no gradual settling, no polite negotiation of temperatures, no sequence of increasingly cold days that gave a person time to prepare the mind alongside the body. What came in the second week of January 1884 came the way a wall comes when a structure fails all at once, without warning, without mercy, and with a totality that left no question about who was in charge. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 18 hours. It dropped past 0 and kept going past 10, below past 20, settling finally at 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and staying there with a stillness that the old-timers in the territory would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe to people who had not been there. It was not simply cold. Cold is a word for the absence of warmth, and what descended on the Black Hills in that second week of January was not an absence. It was a presence, a physical force with weight and intention, something that pressed down on the landscape and on the people in it, with the patience of a thing that understood it had all the time it needed. The sky went white, and then went a strange deep blue, a color that had no name in any language Mara knew. The old-timers would call it later the winter of the blue stillness, and the name was accurate. The air was so cold it was visible a crystalline quality to the light that made every object, every fence post, every frozen branch appear sharpened to an impossible precision. The creek, which had been running slow and dark in December, stopped entirely. The sound it had made was gone, and its absence was its own kind of sound. The trees exploded, not all at once, not in a single catastrophe, but through the nights and the long, silent days at irregular intervals that made them impossible to anticipate or ignore. The sap in the pines froze and expanded and split the wood from the inside with a sound like a rifle shot, a crack that echoed off the hillsides and rolled through the stillness, and then was absorbed by it, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow louder than it had been before. Mara heard the first one from inside the cabin on the night the freeze came down fully, and she lay still in her cot for a long moment afterward, listening to the quiet that followed. Her hand pressed flat against the warm stone of the back wall. She listened to Owen breathing, slow and even, the breathing of a child who was genuinely untroubled, warm. She closed her eyes and let herself feel the wall against her palm, still warm. It had been warm for 8 weeks now, through the modest cold of November and the harder cold of December, and now into this, the real cold, the cold that separated what was sufficient from what was not. 8 weeks of twice daily fires, each one burning hot and fast in the tight, vertical firebox, each one surrendering its heat to the 40 feet of stone tunnel in the hill, each one making a deposit into the thermal bank she had built. 8 weeks of the hill receiving and holding and slowly, continuously returning that heat to the cabin. The wall, the floor, the very air which held a stable, unremarkable warmth that required nothing from anyone and asked for nothing in return. She was not hot. She did not lie in her cot sweating. There was nothing dramatic about the temperature in the cabin. It was simply not cold. It was the temperature of a room that has been lived in by warm-blooded creatures who have found a way to hold on to what they generate. And it was in its quietness, in its complete absence of crisis, the most remarkable thing Mara Bevan had ever built. She lit the morning fire. This was the ritual, and it had become a ritual in the truest sense, a repeated act whose meaning exceeded its function. She rose in the dark, dressed in the dark, moved to the firebox in the dark, with the sure-footedness of long practice. She arranged the wood as she had learned to arrange it, split fine and dry and upright, a small, tight construction designed for fast, complete combustion. She lit it and stood. For the time it took the fire to catch and establish itself, watching the flames work in the confined vertical chamber, watching the smoke move forward and down the throat and into the tunnel beyond. No smoke in the room, not a trace of it. The air was clear and still. She let the fire burn for an hour, sometimes 2, depending on how cold the night had been, and then she let it go out. That was the part that still felt at some level below reason like an act of faith. To let the fire go out, to trust the stone. But the stone had earned that trust week by week through the November cold and the December cold, and now this. And she let it go out and went about her morning, and the cabin remained warm. Owen woke as the fire was burning down, appearing at his cot's edge in the half-dark, with his dark eyes and his father's hair and the expression of practical assessment that he brought to each morning, as though the day were a problem that needed to be correctly diagnosed before it could be properly addressed. He sat for a moment, taking the temperature of the room with the accuracy that children develop when their survival has required them to pay close attention to their environment. "Still warm," he said. It was not a question. "Still warm," she confirmed. He nodded and reached for his clothes. She watched him dress and thought, as she thought every morning about the wood. The supply was holding. This was the thing that still produced in her. Even after 8 weeks of evidence, a small shock of gratitude each time she calculated it. The conventional wisdom of the settlement. Harlan Voss's wisdom, the wisdom of every experienced person in the territory, held that surviving a Black Hills winter required a wood pile of staggering dimensions. The stacks beside the neighboring cabins, the ones that had risen through the summer like monuments, were the physical expression of that wisdom. They represented thousands of hours of cutting and hauling and splitting. They represented the belief that the only way to defeat a great cold was with a great fire. And a great fire was a great consumer. And therefore survival was a matter of accumulation. Mara was burning a fraction of what her neighbors burned, not a small fraction. A fraction that if she had tried to explain it to any of them would have produced first disbelief and then the particular kind of condescension reserved for people who are clearly confused about very basic facts. She was burning perhaps 1 cord of wood for every 8 that a conventional fireplace required in comparable temperatures. The difference was not the size of the fire. The difference was what happened to the heat the fire produced. In a conventional system, the heat went up and out efficiently removed from the cabin by the same mechanism that produced it. In her system, the heat went into the stone. It stayed. It accumulated. It paid for itself over and over through the hours after the fire was out, through the night, through the long, dark mornings, returning the investment with a patience that the winter could not outlast, because the winter was temporary and the stone was not. She knew this. She had known it since August in theory and for 8 weeks in practice. But she also knew that knowing something yourself and being able to make another person understand it were 2 very different things, and that the community of the Black Hills had made its judgment of her in September and had no particular interest in revising it. She did not think often about what Harlan Voss was doing. She thought about it now because the cold outside was the kind of cold that made it difficult not to think about other people's fires. She thought about his house, which she had seen and which was by any honest assessment a fine house. Better built than hers by a considerable margin, dovetailed at the corners with a precision that spoke of real skill, fitted with 2 large south-facing windows to catch the winter sun, insulated with a layer of packed clay between the inner and outer wall surfaces that Voss had developed as his own refinement of standard construction. It was the best house in the settlement, and it had, in the conventional understanding, the best heating system. A large central fireplace of dressed stone with a chimney that drew well and cleared smoke efficiently, and secondary heating from a small iron stove in the back room where the children slept. She thought about his wood pile, which had been the largest in the settlement by autumn. A structure of carefully split and stacked cordwood that she had seen from the road, and that had struck her even then as representing an enormous and genuine commitment of labor. He had cut that wood himself, and he had cut it with the knowledge of a man who understood from experience exactly what he would need to get through to spring. It had been sufficient. It had looked in October more than sufficient. She thought about 40 degrees below zero, and she thought about a large open fireplace, and she thought about the relationship between those two things, and she said nothing to Owen about what she was thinking, and she went about the business of the morning. The days had taken on the quality of extended crystalline silence. The cold that kept everyone indoors also kept sound from traveling normally, so that the settlement, which in summer was animated by the sounds of axes and animals and children, and the 100 small noises of human activity, was nearly mute. Mara heard occasionally the sound of a distant chimney drawing hard against a strong wind, a low, complex moan that carried across the frozen distance. She heard the trees. She heard the creek. Not at all. She and Owen existed in a closed world of reasonable warmth and quiet industry. She mended every piece of clothing they owned, sitting close to the small window in the pale winter light, her needle moving through wool and canvas with the steady rhythm of work that has been reduced to its essential motion. Owen read from their single book, a collection of natural history and practical knowledge published in Edinburgh in 1871, that Ceylon had bought in Cardiff and carried across the Atlantic and across the continent, and that now lived on the shelf above the cots, with a worn reverence that approached the sacred. He read slowly and aloud, which was partly for the company of his own voice, and partly because Mara had long ago established reading aloud as the correct way to read. When you were the only person in the room with a book, he read her about glaciers, about the movement of ice over geological time, the way a glacier advanced inch by inch across a landscape over thousands of years, and the way it retreated with the same patience when the climate shifted. It says here, he said, not looking up from the page, that a glacier holds the cold the same way a stone holds the heat, except it holds it much longer. How much longer? Mara asked. It says here thousands of years. She kept her needle moving. Your father would have liked that, she said. Owen looked up at her. Why? Because it means the earth is patient in both directions, she said. It keeps what it's given. Hot or cold, it remembers. He looked at this for a moment in the way he looked at things that were worth keeping. Then he went back to the glacier. She did not know, sitting there with her needle and her sun and the warm floor under her feet, what was happening 100 yards away in Harlan Voss's house. She did not know because she had not been to the settlement in 3 weeks, the cold having made the road impassable in any practical sense, and because no one had come to her. She was not surprised by this. She had understood since September that her relationship with the community had been definitively renegotiated, and that the terms of the new arrangement did not include informal visits or the exchange of news. What was happening in Harlan Voss's house was this. The woodpile was going. It had seemed in October inexhaustible. It had seemed in November very large. In December it had begun to seem merely large, and then in the first week of January, before the deep freeze had even fully descended, it had begun to seem like a thing with an end to it. Harlan had done the arithmetic on the 4th of January, standing before the pile, with a lantern in the early dark, counting the rows and making calculations he did not want to make, and the calculations had told him something that his 30 years of experience had not adequately prepared him for. He was gonna run out, not immediately, not in a week, but by the third week of January if the cold held at its current depth, and all the signs suggested it would hold much longer than that he would be burning the last of the cordwood. And after that, there was the furniture. He had already in his mind made the inventory: the spare bed frame in the back room, the 2 chairs in the kitchen that they used, least the workbench in the lean-to, the lumber he had stored for spring construction projects. He had calculated as calmly and as honestly as he could how long the furniture would last at current consumption. It was not a comfortable calculation. His wife, Dora, knew. She was not a woman who required information to be delivered to her directly. She read the situation from the way he stood at the woodpile with the lantern, and from the quality of his silence at the dinner table, and from the speed at which his jaw worked when he was thinking about something he did not want to say. She did not ask him directly because direct questions in situations like this produce direct answers. And direct answers had a way of making things real that were better held at some slight distance from reality for as long as possible. They managed. That was the word she used to herself. They managed. The fire burned through the night, as it had to, because the temperature in the back room where Sarah and her 2 brothers slept would drop to dangerous levels within an hour of the fire going out. Harlan knew this because he had tested it in November, letting the fire die at midnight and waking at 3 in the morning to a room that was cold enough to see his breath and clearly cold enough to have produced a thin rime of frost on the inside of the window glass. He had not tested it again. He did not need to know how cold it would get if the fire went out in 40 below temperatures. He knew already in the approximate sense, and the approximate sense was sufficient. So the fire burned through the night, consuming wood at a rate that produced warmth for a radius of perhaps 8 feet around the hearth in the main room. The rest of the house existed in a state of managed cold, not life-threatening cold, not yet, but the kind of cold that makes people move constantly, that keeps them in layers of clothing, even indoors, that makes sleep a shallow, unrestful thing from which a person wakes feeling not refreshed but merely less tired. Sarah developed a cough in the 2nd week of January. She was 11 years old, Harlan's youngest, a girl of exceptional stubbornness and good humor, who had taken the cold of November and December as a personal challenge and had not complained about it once. She had worn her extra socks and her extra shirt, and she had read her books by the fire. And she had been, by any measure, exactly the kind of child you wanted beside you in a difficult winter, stoic, cheerful, and unbothered by the kind of low-grade discomfort that makes ordinary times feel like hardship. But the cough was different. It started on the 14th of January, a dry, shallow cough that she excused and ignored and minimized in the way that children minimize illness when they understand at some not entirely conscious level that being sick would be a burden on the people around them. But by the 16th it had deepened, moved down from her throat into her chest, and she was breathing with a slight but audible effort that Harlan heard from across the room, and that produced in him a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew that sound. He had heard it before in the winter of 1879 from his eldest son who had recovered. He had heard it from his neighbor, Peterson's youngest, who had not. He knew it the way a man knows the sound of a structure beginning to fail, not from a single noise, but from the quality of it, the particular resonance of something working harder than it should, because the conditions around it had exceeded its design. He put more wood on the fire. It was the only tool he had. On the 17th of January, he burned the 2 kitchen chairs. He broke them apart with methodical efficiency, the way he did everything, separating the rungs from the seat boards and the legs from the frame, and stacking the pieces beside the fire with the same care he had always taken with the cordwood. It produced a certain amount of heat, somewhat less per volume than seasoned pine, but heat nonetheless. It bought time. He did not think yet about what came after the chairs. Sarah's breathing on the night of the 17th was shallow and rapid, a quick, papery sound that made Dora sit upright in their bed and not lie down again until morning. Harlan lay beside her and listened and thought, with the methodical clarity that crisis sometimes produces in men who are better at thinking than at feeling about options. There were not many options. He could go to the Hendersons a quarter mile east. He had helped Henderson with his roof in September, and Henderson had helped him with the woodpile, and there was a credit between them that could be called in. But Henderson had his own family and his own fire and his own woodpile, which was, from what Harlan had been able to observe from the road in early January, not dramatically larger than his own. He could go to the settlement to the general store, which had a wood stove and represented a kind of communal last resort. But the road between his property and the settlement was in this cold a serious physical challenge, a half-mile of exposed ground, with no shelter at 40 below, with a wind that had been running out of the northwest for 4 days. He lay in the dark and thought about the Welsh widow. He had not thought about her often since September. He had thought about her in October once when someone at the general store had mentioned that she was still digging, and had not, as of that date, killed herself or the boy. He had thought about her briefly in November, when the first hard cold had come with the mixture of professional concern and personal guilt that he had not fully examined and had put aside as efficiently as he could. He had thought about her in December not at all. He thought about her now with a specificity that was at its core shameful. And he did not look away from the shame because he was, whatever his faults, a man who faced what was true. She was dead. She and the boy were almost certainly dead. The smoke had turned back. The cold had come in through the walls. The little wood she had accumulated had run out in December, or the system she had built had failed in the first serious cold, or both. He had been right about all of it, and she had been wrong. And the tragedy of it, the specific terrible waste of a woman of obvious intelligence and determination, dying from her own conviction, was the kind of thing that settled into a man's chest and did not come out clean. But there was a wood pile at the Bevan property. He had seen it in October, a small thing by any measure. The accumulation of a woman cutting wood alone through a summer with a 7-year-old child as her only help. It had not looked like enough then. It was certainly not enough to have sustained her into January. but it was there stacked against the side of the cabin, and if she and the boy were gone, the wood was not doing anyone any good. And Sarah was breathing with that papery, rapid sound in the back room. He lay with this thought for a long time. He was not a man who stole from the dead. He had never been that man. He had prided himself over a long life of difficult circumstances on not being that man. But the arithmetic of the situation had a clarity that his pride could not fully obscure. His daughter was sick. The cold was not breaking. The wood was almost gone. He rose before dawn on the morning of the 19th. He dressed in every layer he owned, which was a considerable number of layers, built up over 11 years of Black Hills winters into a system of wool and canvas and fur that represented his accumulated knowledge of staying alive in serious cold. He pulled on the outer coat, the one with the wolf fur collar that he had made himself in the winter of 1877, and that had on multiple occasions been the difference between discomfort and genuine danger. He wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes were visible. He told Dora he was going for wood. She did not ask where. The cold outside the cabin door was a physical assault, a blow that struck every exposed surface simultaneously and reached immediately through the layers to find the skin beneath them. His breath, even through the scarf, came back to him as ice crystals on the wool. His eyes, the only part of him uncovered, felt the cold immediately in a deep, structural way. A pain behind the eyeballs rather than on their surface. He put his head down and walked. The snow was not deep, but it was hard and dry, compacted by the cold to the point where it squeaked under his boots. With each step, an alien sound, a sound that had no analog in ordinary experience, the sound of a material so cold it had lost every quality associated with ordinary winter snow and had become something else entirely. His breath plumes were torn away by the wind before they could rise. He did not look up from the ground immediately before him. 100 yards. He had paced it once in September out of the habit of a man who knows his measurements. 100 yards from his front door to the Bevan property across the open ground between the two claims. In ordinary weather, 3 or 4 minutes of brisk walking. In this, with the wind and the hard snow and the cold pressing on him from every direction simultaneously, it was something else. He moved through it the way he moved through every difficult physical task, with his attention on the next step rather than the destination, because the destination was too far to think about, and the next step was immediate and achievable. He did not think about what he would find when he got there, or he tried not to. But the mind does what it does, and what his mind did in the 100 yards between his door and hers was produce the image he had been carrying since September. The cabin dark and cold, the chimney smokeless. The door perhaps pushed open by the wind, and the interior exposed to the killing air. 2 small figures in the cots, still frost-covered, gone. He had seen death from cold before, and it was not violent. That was the worst of it in a way. It was peaceful looking. It looked like sleep. He thought about the woodpile. It was a practical, survivable amount of shame. The shame of thinking about the woodpile while imagining the 2 figures in the cots. He was a practical man in a practical crisis, and the shame of the thought was something he could carry. He reached the edge of the Bevan property. He stopped. There was smoke. He stood in the wind and the cold, and he looked at the chimney. The small, nearly invisible chimney that emerged from the slope of the hill well above the cabin, and there was smoke rising from it. Thin smoke pale against the white-blue sky moving quickly in the wind, but smoke. Unmistakable. The smoke of a fire that was burning or had recently burned. He stood looking at it for what was probably 10 seconds, but felt much longer. The smoke did not make sense. He had been certain, not hopeful, not tentative, but certain with the certainty of a professional who has correctly diagnosed 100 structural failures that her system could not work. He had been certain in September when he told her so, and he had remained certain through October and November and December, not because he had checked or observed or gathered any evidence, but because the certainty had been established in September and had not been challenged. He looked at the smoke. He moved toward the cabin. He told himself as he moved that the smoke was a coincidence of some kind, a trick of his vision or a last remnant of something that had burned out days ago. Perhaps a beam in the wall that had caught and smoldered. He told himself that the smoke was not what it appeared to be. He told himself these things with decreasing conviction as he came closer to the cabin, and the smoke above the hill remained steady and real, and unmistakably the smoke of an active functioning system. He reached the cabin door. He stood before it for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. Then he raised his fist and knocked. The sound was loud in the frozen silence. 3 hard blows of a gloved fist against the wood, and it echoed off the hillside behind the cabin and was swallowed by the stillness. He waited. He heard nothing from inside. He raised his fist again. The bar on the inside moved. He heard it scrape back in its bracket. The sound of a door that was regularly used and well maintained, the sound of an inhabited space. And then the door opened. Mara Bevan stood in the doorway. She was wearing a wool dress. Not her work dress, which he had seen covered in mud in September, but a plain house dress, the kind of garment a woman wears when she is indoors in a temperature that does not require defensive layering. She was not wearing a shawl. She was not wearing an extra shirt beneath the dress. She was wearing what a woman wears in a warm room. He looked past her. The boy, Owen, was on the floor near the back wall. He was sitting cross-legged with a collection of small, carved figures arranged before him in some disposition of battle or journey that only he understood. He was wearing a shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. Harlan Voss stood in the doorway of the Bevan cabin on the 19th of January, 1884, with 40 degrees of frost at his back, and looked at a 7-year-old boy sitting on the floor with his sleeves rolled up, and the world as he understood it shifted beneath him in a way that was physical, a genuine destabilization, as though the frozen ground itself had moved. Then the heat reached him. It came through the open door, past the woman in the wool dress. A wave of warmth that enveloped him so completely and so suddenly that his body responded before his mind did. The cold tightened muscles across his shoulders and back, releasing in a single involuntary spasm. the ice crystals on his scarf and eyebrows beginning to melt. It was not the aggressive, scorching heat of a large fire in a small space. It was not the hit-and-miss warmth of a conventional hearth, hot in front and cold behind. It was something else, something he had no immediate framework for, a warmth that seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the floor and the walls and the very air of the room, steady and pervasive and deep. The warmth of a space that had been warm for a long time and had not at any point stopped being warm. He stepped inside. He did not ask permission, and she did not offer it. The situation had moved past the conventions of asking and offering. He came in and she closed the door behind him, and he stood in the middle of the room and pulled the scarf from his face and breathed. The air was clean. That was the thing he noticed next after the heat, and it struck him with a force that was disproportionate to its apparent significance. The air in the room was clean. There was no smoke. There was no wood smoke smell. No accumulation of combustion products in the air. None of the low-grade haze that hung in every cabin he had been in this winter. The inevitable byproduct of burning enough wood to stay alive indoors. The air in the Bevan cabin smelled of pine and wool and the faint mineral scent of stone, and it was clear. He looked at the firebox. He had not seen it since the original hearth had been in place, and it took him a moment to register what he was looking at. The opening was small, perhaps a third the width of a conventional hearth, tight and vertical, faced with carefully fitted stone. Inside it, on a bed of white ash, a few pieces of wood burned with a quiet, complete intensity, the fire working hard in the confined space, its color a deep, clean orange, rather than the yellower, smokier flame of a poorly drawing fire. As he watched, a thin thread of smoke rose from the wood and moved forward into the tunnel throat and disappeared. No smoke in the room. The smoke left. It simply left, drawn forward and away by something at the far end, pulled out of the room with a steadiness that produced in the room itself a complete and remarkable absence. He looked at the back wall. The wall that abutted the hillside was faced with the same flat creek stone she had used in the tunnel set, in careful courses from floor to ceiling. In another context, in another state of mind, he would have assessed it as competent work, solid and clean. Right now he looked at it with a different kind of attention, with the attention of a man trying to understand something that his existing knowledge cannot explain. He crossed to the wall and removed his outer glove. He pressed his palm against the stone. The wall was warm. Not warm the way a wall near a large fire is warm, which is to say warm on the surface and cold behind the heat, shallow and temporary. This warmth was deep. It came from inside the stone, or rather from behind the stone from the tunnel, and the earth beyond it, and it radiated outward into the room with the steady, tireless generosity of a thing that has a great deal to give and is in no hurry to give it all at once. He pressed his palm harder against the stone, as though pressure might produce a different result, as though the warmth might prove to be a surface illusion that would give way under examination. It did not give way. It deepened. His palm, chilled by the walk from his cabin, pulled the warmth from the stone as fast as the stone could produce it. and the stone produced it faster. The heat moved through his palm and up his wrist, and he stood with his hand flat against the warm back wall of a woman's cabin in January in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory, and tried to understand what he was touching. He took his hand from the wall and looked at it as though his own palm might have something useful to tell him. Then he crouched down. He was a large man, and it was not an elegant motion, but he went down onto one knee on the wooden floorboards, and he pressed his bare palm flat against the wood. The floor was warm, not dramatically warm, not uncomfortably warm, but distinctly materially undeniably warm. A warmth that came up through the boards from the earth beneath them, from the clay and rock that the tunnel system ran through from the thermal mass that had been absorbing the heat of Mara's fires for 8 weeks, and was now, with the reliability of everything geological, returning it. Harlan Voss knelt on the warm floor of the Bevan cabin with his palm against the boards, and he was for the first time in a very long time lost. He was not a man who lost himself easily or ever. He had built his life and his reputation on the bedrock of knowing how structures worked, knowing what materials could be trusted, knowing the limits of what the land and the climate would permit. He had built that knowledge over 30 years of hard, attentive work, and it had served him and the people around him well, and he had been right to trust it, because it had been in all the ways that had mattered to this point correct. But it had not included this: 30 years of building in the Black Hills, and his knowledge had not included a warm floor in January in a cabin with a small fire in a tight firebox, and an absence of smoke, and a woman in a house dress. His knowledge had not included this, and this was real. And the distance between his knowledge and this reality was the distance between what he had been and what he was now, kneeling on the warm floor of the Bevan cabin, which was very far. He stayed on one knee for a moment longer than was necessary. Owen had looked up from his soldiers when Harlan came in and had watched the entire proceeding with the grave, assessing attention he brought to all adult behavior. He watched Harlan press his palm against the wall. He watched him kneel on the floor. He watched him stay there. The boy's expression was not unkind. It was the expression of a person watching another person arrive somewhere. They have been for some time. A kind of patient recognition. Harlan stood. He turned to Mara Bevan, who had not moved from the area near the door, who had not spoken since she had let him in, who had allowed him to conduct his examination of her cabin in silence, because she understood that some things could only be learned by touch, and that words would not have served. He looked at her with his hat in his hands, because at some point in the preceding minutes he had removed it without noticing, and he looked at her with an expression that had nothing left in it of the man who had stood outside this cabin in September and delivered his verdict. He said one word. How? It came out rougher than he intended. Rougher than a question, and not quite a statement. A word that was trying to be several things at once, and achieving all of them imperfectly. It held the weight of everything that had just collapsed. The certainty, the professional authority, the 30 years of knowing the verdict of September. The walk across the frozen ground with the intention of taking her wood. All of it was in that one word compressed into its single syllable by the inadequacy of language in the face of the thing he was trying to express. Mara looked at him for a moment. She looked at him the way she had looked at the warm stone wall in August, with a directness that was not aggressive, but was entirely without apology. She had been right. They both knew it. But there was nothing in her face that wanted to make him know it any more than he already did. The battle had never been against him. The battle had always been against the cold, and the cold was a shared enemy. And standing here in this room that was warm, because she had built it to be warm, with a man who had come here in the cold, because his daughter was sick. The battle lines were obvious, and the side she was on was obvious. She crossed to the firebox and took a piece of charcoal from the edge of the ash bed, a chunk of incompletely burned wood, black and light. She looked around the room, and then she went to the floorboards near the back wall and crouched down, and she began to draw. She drew with the certainty of a woman who had been building this picture in her mind since August and had never stopped building it. She drew the firebox small and vertical and tight, and the throat where it met the horizontal tunnel. And she drew the tunnel itself running back and into the hill, long and low, and lined with stone. She drew the chimney at the far end rising 20 feet from the base of the vertical shaft to the surface of the slope emerging barely visible from the natural stone of the hillside. She drew it all on the warm wooden floor in charcoal, and it was precise and complete and entirely clear. Harlan Voss crouched beside her and looked at the drawing. He did not speak while she drew. He was learning to not speak, which was a new discipline for him and one that required effort. He looked at the drawing the way he looked at building plans, with the professional intelligence that was underneath everything else that had happened in the past hour, still intact and still working. He saw it. He saw it the way you see a thing that has been in front of you all along, but required a specific angle of light to become visible. The long horizontal channel, the heat transferring from the hot gas to the cool stone of the channel foot by foot the entire 40-foot length. The stone storing the heat, holding it with the thermal mass of the hill behind it, releasing it slowly back into the cabin, through the back wall and the floor. The gases arriving at the base of the vertical chimney, cooled and tamed, but still warm enough relative to the outside air to produce a steady upward draw. The whole system maintaining itself in a continuous self-sustaining loop that required nothing but a small hot fire twice a day and a great deal of stone. He had told her the smoke would not make the journey. He had been thinking about ordinary smoke, the lazy, voluminous smoke of an ordinary fire, the smoke that filled a room and drifted, and had no particular motivation to go anywhere in a hurry. He had not been thinking about the tight, superheated gases of a small, intensely hot firebox, gases that were moving under pressure, that had been given a single viable exit, and were moving toward it with the force of combustion behind them. He had been thinking about the wrong smoke. He sat back on his heels and looked at the drawing for a long time. "The stone holds it," he said. It was not a question. "The stone holds it," Mara said, "the same way it holds the cold in a mine or the summer in a boulder. It doesn't know the difference between them. It only knows temperature. and it moves always toward the middle. You give it heat, it stores it. Then it gives it back. How long? He asked. 18 hours after the fire goes out, she said. Sometimes longer in the deep cold when I burn for 2 hours instead of 1. He thought about his own woodpile. He thought about the chairs burning in the kitchen. He thought about Sarah breathing with that papery sound in the back room of his cabin, 100 yards away in the killing cold. He was doing arithmetic, the same arithmetic he had done in October, before his woodpile, but running the numbers in a different direction now. From her system, back toward the conventional. The difference was staggering. Her woodpile was small because her woodpile was sufficient. The entire premise of his September assessment had been built on an assumption about how heat worked that her system had simply made wrong. He looked at Mara Bevan, who was watching him with the quiet attention of someone who has seen a person arrive at a difficult understanding and is waiting to see what they do with it. He said, "Sarah is sick. Her breathing." Mara's expression changed. Not dramatically. She was not a dramatic woman. But it changed in the way that another parent's expression changes when they hear a specific combination of words from another parent in the middle of a hard winter. "How long?" she asked. 5 days, he said. "Maybe 6. She stood and went to the shelf near the window without another word and began assembling things, a cloth, a small stopper jar of something dark, a tin cup. She filled the cup with water from the pot on the back of the firebox and set it to warm. "You will take this back with you," she said, not looking up. "It's a steam preparation, eucalyptus and pine resin. You hold it under her nose, or you set it on a warm surface near where she sleeps, and let the vapor work. It will help the breathing." He watched her hands moving with the efficient certainty of someone who knew what she was doing. "I also have wood," she said. "Not much, but enough for tonight and part of tomorrow. Take what you need." The offer landed in the room with a weight that he felt in his chest. She was offering him wood. She was offering him the man who had come to her cabin to take from a dead woman. The man who had told her in September that she was building a tomb. The man whose verdict had sealed her off from the community that might have helped her through the hardest months. She was offering him wood. Not because he deserved it. Not because the debt between them was settled or even acknowledged. But because the cold was a shared enemy and the enemy was at the door. He said, "Mistress Bevan, I owe you. Take the wood," she said. "We can account for the rest later." He took the wood. He took the small bundle she assembled from her pile, enough for a night and a morning. He took the tin preparation for Sarah's breathing wrapped in cloth to keep it warm for the walk back. He stood at the door with these things in his arms and looked at her, and he looked at the warm room behind her, and he looked at the drawing on the floor. "When the cold breaks," he said. She waited. "I want to understand all of it," he said. "Everything you know about how this works. I want to understand it properly, not just the shape of it. The principles. Why it works the way it works." She looked at him for a moment. "When the cold breaks," she said. He nodded. He wrapped his face in the scarf and opened the door, and the cold came in for the single moment the door was open, hard and immediate and absolute. He went out into it and pulled the door shut behind him. And outside the wind had picked up and was moving across the open ground between the two properties, with a voice that was indifferent to everything. He walked back the way he had come with the wood in his arms and the tin cup warm through the cloth against his chest. Above him on the slope of the hill, the thin pale smoke from Mara Bevan's chimney rose into the blue stillness, moving in the wind, steady and quiet and continuous. The sign of a system that was working. The sign of heat being made and stored and returned deep in the earth, patient and reliable, moving through stone. The way time moves through everything without effort, without drama, without end. He did not look at it, but he knew it was there. The cold broke on the 28th of January. It did not break gradually. It did not soften by degrees, offering the settlement a slow and merciful return to the merely difficult temperatures of early winter. It broke the way it had come, all at once, a shift in the wind from northwest to southwest that arrived in the small hours of the morning and raised the temperature 30 degrees in 4 hours. By dawn, the sky had changed color from the deep mineral blue of the freeze to the pale washed gray of a normal winter morning, and the trees on the hillsides had stopped exploding, and the creek somewhere under its armor of ice had begun to move again, a sound so faint and so welcome that Mara lay in her cot for a long time after she woke and simply listened to it. She had survived. The word was too small for what it contained. She lay in the gray morning light and let the full weight of it settle onto her. She had survived the winter of the blue stillness, the winter that the old-timers would describe for the rest of their lives, the winter that had tested everything the settlement possessed and had found the conventional answer wanting. She had survived it with a woodpile that still had logs in it. She had survived it with a floor that was warm beneath her feet, and a back wall that radiated a steady, deep heat, and a son who was healthy and unafraid, and sleeping in his cot, with his carved soldiers arranged in a careful row along the shelf above his head. She had survived it, and she was not sure yet what to do with that. Owen woke as she was building the morning fire, appearing at the edge of his cot, with his hair pressed flat on one side, and his eyes carrying their customary morning gravity, the expression of a person taking stock of the day before committing to it. He sat for a moment listening, and she watched him hear the same thing she had heard when she woke, the distant tentative sound of the creek beginning to move. "It's breaking," he said. "It's breaking," she said. He looked at this for a moment with the thoroughness he brought to all information. "Will people come now?" he asked. She looked at him. He was 7 years old, and he had spent 6 weeks in a cabin with his mother and his wooden soldiers and a book about glaciers, and he had not complained once. He had watched her with those dark, patient eyes, and he had done his work without being asked, and he had trusted her with a completeness that still, when she let herself feel it fully, made the breath catch in her chest. "Some will come," she said. "Will Mr. Voss come?" She thought about the man who had stood on her warm floor 9 days ago and said one word. She thought about the way he had knelt on the floorboards, with his palm pressed flat against the wood. The way a man kneels not from choice, but from the simple failure of the legs to continue holding what the mind can no longer support. She thought about how he had looked at the drawing on the floor, not with the dismissive certainty of September, but with the focused attention of a craftsman confronting a piece of work that exceeds his understanding and demands to be understood. "Yes," she said, "Mr. Voss will come." He nodded, satisfied, and came to the fire to warm his hands. Harlan Voss came on the 2nd of February. He came alone, which she had expected, and he came in the morning, which she had also expected. Because a man who wanted to learn something came in the morning when the mind was fresh and the light was good, and there was enough of the day remaining to go home and think about what he had learned before he slept. He came without his coat of authority, without the manner that had filled her doorway in September, like a piece of furniture too large for the room. He came in his working clothes with a notebook tucked under his arm and a pencil behind his ear, and an expression that she recognized from watching Celine approach a problem he intended to solve. He intended to understand. She had put water on before he arrived, not because she had known exactly when he would come, but because she had known he would come soon, and she had wanted to be ready in the way that a person is ready when they have something important to give, and do not want the giving of it to be cluttered by the small, unnecessary logistics of hospitality. She poured him water when he sat down, and he accepted it, and they looked at each other across the small table in the cabin that was warm without apology, and then she said, "Where do you want to start?" He said, "From the beginning, from why the conventional system fails." She appreciated this. It told her he was not looking for a set of instructions to copy. He was looking for the principles, the underlying logic that the instructions expressed. A man who wanted only the instructions would build the thing once and never understand it well enough to improve it. A man who wanted the principles could build it 100 times in 100 different configurations and make it better each time. She started from the beginning. She talked about heat, not fire, but heat itself. Fire is the process that releases heat. Heat is the energy, and once released, it belongs to no one and obeys only the laws of its own nature. Heat moves from hot to cold, she said. Always, without exception. You cannot stop it from doing this. You can only choose where the cold thing is. Harlan wrote in his notebook carefully the way he measured timber once with precision, because the measurement would have to be trusted later. In a conventional hearth, she continued, the cold thing is the outside air. The heat moves from the fire to the air in the room, yes, but the fire also creates a powerful draw, and the draw pulls the very warmth it has just produced up and out through the chimney. For every volume of warm air that leaves, the same volume of cold air comes in from outside. So you are not heating your room. You are heating a column of air that moves through your room on its way out. Harlan stopped writing and looked at her. I have been building chimneys that draw well for 30 years, he said slowly. I have always considered a good draw to be the sign of a well-built system. A good draw is the sign of an efficient pump, she said. What it pumps out is your heat. She could see him working through it, running the logic against 30 years of experience. It did not fail. She could see the moment he understood that it did not fail a slight shift in the quality of his stillness. "The tunnel changes where the cold thing is," she said. "The stone of the tunnel becomes the cold thing. The heat moves from the hot gas to the cool stone all along the 40 feet of passage. The stone holds it. And then the stone becomes the warm thing and the air in the cabin is the cool thing and the heat moves from the stone into the room, slowly, over hours, without effort and without waste." Owen, sitting at the tunnel entrance with his soldiers, looked up. "The stone remembers," he said without looking at either of them. Harlan glanced at the boy, then back at Mara. "Yes," she said. "The stone remembers." They worked through the morning. Harlan asked about the angle of the tunnel, the dimensions, the design of the firebox. She described the tall, tight, vertical chamber, and the way confinement concentrated the combustion pushed the fire to burn hotter and more completely, producing a smaller volume of far hotter gas than a large open hearth could ever generate. "You are making the fire earn its keep," she said. "A large fire in a large space is lazy. A small fire in a tight space has no room for laziness. It must burn completely, and everything it produces must go somewhere useful." He drew diagrams alongside his notes, the quick, precise sketches of a man who thought in 3 dimensions. She watched his pencil move and recognized in the quality of the drawings the same instinct she had seen in Selin, the underground man's feel for how volume and passage and pressure interact in confined spaces. She told him about the chimney height, the mechanism of the draw, and the reason the far chimney was more powerful than any path backward into the room. "The gas at the firebox is under pressure," she said. "It moves toward the strongest available draw, which is the far chimney. The room offers no draw at all. A sealed room is not a path of least resistance. It is not a path at all." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have listened in September," he said. She poured more water into his cup. "You had no reason to," she said. "Everything you knew told you it would not work, and everything you knew had been correct for 30 years. It was not enough," he said. "No," she said. "It was not enough for this winter." He looked at his notebook, at the pages of careful writing and precise drawings, like a map for country he had already crossed and been lost in. "I want to build one," he said, "in my house, and then I want to build them in every house in this settlement. The principles can be adapted," she said. "Every house is different. The relationship between the firebox and the available stone mass, the direction the tunnel can run, the height the chimney can achieve, given the terrain, these will all differ. The principles remain the same. The application must be thought through each time. That is true of everything worth building," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He closed the notebook and held it for a moment. Then he looked at her directly. "Mistress Bevan," he said, "I came to your door 9 days ago with the intention of taking your wood. I thought you were dead. I told myself the wood was doing no one any good." He stopped. He started again. "I had been telling myself things since September that I should not have been telling myself. About your judgment, about your capability. The fire in the small firebox burned quietly behind her. The tunnel drew the smoke forward and away. "Your daughter is better?" she asked. Something shifted in his face, smaller and more personal than the shifts she had seen before. The breathing cleared. He said, "2 days after. The preparation you gave me." "Good," she said with the finality that moved the subject forward. "Then let us talk about your house. Tell me where the hill sits relative to your south wall and how deep the foundation goes and what is behind the main room." And they did. They talked through the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, the notebook open on the table between them, the drawings growing more detailed and specific as the principles moved from the general to the particular. At some point, Owen came in from the tunnel entrance and listened with the expression of a person following the conversation more closely than his age suggested he should be able to, and then went back to his soldiers. At some point, Mara heated what remained of the morning stew, and they ate without ceremony. When Harlan left in the middle of the afternoon with the pale winter light already flattening toward evening, he carried his notebook and a small bundle of split pine. He paused at the door and looked back at the room. The small, tight firebox with its quiet fire, the warm floor, the stone wall radiating its steady heat. The boy on the floor with his soldiers, the woman at the table who was already looking at the next thing. He said, "What do you call it, the system?" She had not called it anything. It was the thing she had built. It did not require a name to function. "I haven't named it," she said. He thought for a moment. "The Bevan Hearth," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man making a decision he has already made. "That is what we will call it when we build them, so that people know where it came from." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not diminish what he had just done, which was simple and correct, and she had not expected it and did not know how to hold it, except with silence. He nodded once and went out into the cold afternoon, and she stood at the window and watched him cross the open ground toward his house. A large man moving with purpose through the thin remaining snow, the notebook under his arm, the bundle of pine against his chest. Owen appeared beside her. He watched Harlan until the man disappeared over the rise. "He'll build it right," Owen said. "Yes," Mara said. "He will." Harlan Voss built his first Bevan hearth in March. He dismantled the back of his main room fireplace with methodical efficiency, pulling the dressed stones apart and stacking them with the care of a man who knew he would use them again. He excavated the tunnel himself, working alone in the evenings after the family was settled on his hands and knees in the dark, with a lantern hanging from a timber brace, moving the earth foot by foot the way Mara had moved it the previous summer. He had advantages she had not had. He had 30 years of knowledge about stone and mortar and the behavior of materials under stress. He had tools she had not possessed. His terrain was less granite and more sandstone, which was easier to work and slightly less efficient, as thermal mass a trade-off he had calculated and accepted. He ran his tunnel 35 feet rather than 40, because the configuration of his lot did not permit a clean 40-foot run in the optimal direction. and 35 feet of well-fitted stone tunnel in a sandstone hillside was by his calculation sufficient. He built the firebox with a craftsman's precision that Mara, when she came in April to see it and help him light the first fire, recognized as entirely his own contribution to the design. Where she had built hers with the materials and skills available to a woman working alone under pressure, Harlan had built his with dressed stone and careful mortar, the joints tight and clean, the vertical chamber perfectly plumb. It was, she told him honestly, better than hers. The bones were hers. The execution was his. He looked at this assessment with the comfortable seriousness of a craftsman who knows the difference between credit and accuracy. "The principles are yours," he said. "The stonework is mine. They need each other." The first fire burned cleanly. The smoke went forward and disappeared into the tunnel with the same quiet purposefulness she had watched in her own system 6 months earlier. And she and Harlan and Dora and the 3 children stood in the main room of the Voss house and waited. And the wall slowly warmed and the floor slowly warmed, and the afternoon light moved across the room in its ordinary way, while the extraordinary thing that was not visible and made no sound performed its work deep in the sandstone hill. Sarah, who had been well since January and who was, Mara had concluded, a girl of exceptional constitution, pressed her palm against the back wall and reported the temperature every few minutes with the precision of a natural experimenter. "Warmer," she said. "Warmer. Still warmer." Owen, who had come with Mara, observed this from a respectful distance, with the expression of a person watching someone else discover something he has known for a long time. "It takes time," he told Sarah, with the authority of a 7-year-old who has been watching thermal mass work since November. "But it doesn't stop." By May, Harlan Voss had built 3 more. The Henderson house was first because Henderson had been Harlan's closest neighbor, and because Henderson's wife had developed over the course of the winter a particular and specific hatred for their conventional fireplace that expressed itself in a clarity of motivation when Harlan came to explain what he proposed to do to it. Henderson himself had questions, the practical questions of a farmer who needed to understand how something worked before he would trust his family to it. Harlan answered them with the notebook open on the table with the drawings and the principles Mara had given him. And then he answered them with something the notebook did not contain: his own winter's experience of standing in Mara's cabin with his palm against the warm stone wall, and understanding in his body before his mind that what he was touching was real and sufficient and fundamentally different from anything he had built before. "I have been in the Bevan cabin," he told Henderson, "in January, in the worst of it. The floor was warm." Henderson looked at him for a long moment. "The floor," he said. "The floor," Harlan said. Construction began the following week. The next house was Alderman Pruitt's, a man who had lost 2 cattle to the cold in January and whose wife had refused to leave the fireside for 6 weeks, and who was by spring possessed of a conviction about the inadequacy of their heating system that had transcended opinion and become geological fact. Pruitt himself was harder to convince, being a man whose skepticism was structural rather than temporary, but he was also a man who respected. demonstrated results above all other forms of evidence. "Come and put your hand on Henderson's floor," Harlan said. Pruitt came. He put his hand on Henderson's floor, warm on a cold April morning with no fire in the new firebox, running on the residual heat of the previous evening's burn. He held his hand there for 30 seconds. He said nothing. He stood and looked at Harlan. "How long since the fire went out?" Pruitt asked. 14 hours, Harlan said. Pruitt was quiet for another moment. "I want one," he said. "Word moves through a small settlement, the way heat moves through stone, slowly from person to person, through the dense medium of conversation and observation. And the particular attention that people pay to information that might determine whether their children survive the next winter. It moves without drama and without announcement. It simply moves because the conditions favor movement, and because the human need for warmth is older and more insistent than any habit of skepticism. Mara was present for none of this mostly. She worked her land through the spring. The garden, the slow and patient attempt to coax something useful from the thin soil at the edges of the granite. She repaired the cabin. She cut wood for the following winter, a smaller amount than her neighbors. A fact that was no longer a source of pity, but had become slowly and without ceremony a source of interest. She traded preserved food with the Henderson family and helped Dora Voss with a difficult piece of sewing. And she attended the community gatherings that the warming weather made possible, and stood at the edges of conversations about the Bevan hearth with the careful stillness of someone who has said what she had to say and is content to let the thing she built speak for itself. She was asked questions sometimes, usually by women who had a directness about practical necessity that the men's habit of professional pride occasionally complicated. The women wanted to know about the maintenance, how to clear the tunnel if it became blocked, how to tell if the firebox was drawing correctly, how to manage the burn length in varying temperatures. These were good questions. The questions of people who intended to run the system themselves without depending on someone else to understand it for them. Mara answered them fully and without condescension, the way Selin had always answered her questions, as though the person asking had every right to a complete understanding. And the only question was how to express the thing clearly enough to provide one. Harlan Voss was asked questions too, and he answered them differently from the builder's perspective. From the perspective of dimensions and materials and the specific challenges of each site. He and Mara had developed, without discussing it explicitly, a complementary approach to the spread of what they had built together. She gave the principles. He gave the craft. The principles without the craft produced systems that worked in theory and sometimes failed in practice. The craft without the principles produced systems that were beautifully built and fundamentally misunderstood, which meant they could not be fixed when they went wrong, because fixing a thing requires understanding why it works. Together they produced something that could be understood and built and maintained and improved. By the following autumn, 12 households in the settlement had a Bevan hearth. The winter of 1884 to 1885 was not as severe as the winter of the blue stillness. No winter in the memory of the oldest resident of the Black Hills had been as severe as the winter of the blue stillness, and the old-timers said, with the proprietary authority of people who have survived something that others have only heard about, that they hoped no winter ever would be again. But it was a hard winter by any ordinary standard, with sustained temperatures well below zero through January and February, and a cold snap in late February that lasted 10 days and tested every heating system in the territory. No one in the settlement died from the cold. This was not on the surface a remarkable statement, but the winter of the blue stillness had established with brutal clarity that ordinary preparation was not adequate for what the Black Hills could produce, and the 12 households with Bevan hearths came through the hard weeks of 1885 with their wood supplies intact and their families warm in a way that was not anxious or provisional, but settled a warmth that did not require constant tending and perpetual fear of the woodpile running out. The 4 households that had not yet converted sat differently in the cold weeks of February. They sat closer to their fires and consumed more wood and slept less easily, and felt in the bones, if not always in the mind, the particular exhaustion of people who are fighting rather than resting. It was not the crisis of January 1884, but it was a reminder, and the reminder was effective. By spring, 2 more households had asked Harlan for the plans. He gave them freely. This was something he and Mara had discussed once, in the practical, unsentimental way that they discussed most things. The question had resolved itself quickly. The design was not a commercial product. It was a solution to a problem that every family in the territory shared equally, and the families that did not have the solution were at risk. And people at risk were in a community this small, and this isolated everyone's concern. There was nothing to protect, and no reason to protect it. The information wanted to spread, and spreading it was the correct thing to do. Harlan made copies of the relevant pages of his notebook, the principles in Mara's words and the drawings in his hand, and he gave them to men who came from the next county, asking about the system they had heard about from a trader who had spent a night at the Henderson house and slept in a room with a warm floor, and had arrived at his next destination, unable to stop talking about it. The trader's name was Elwood Carr, a man of genuine curiosity and the kind of mobile information network that traders in isolated territories necessarily become. He had arrived at the Henderson house in November of 1884. Eaten supper, slept in the back room on a bed. He later described as the warmest sleeping experience of his adult life, and spent most of the following morning asking Henderson detailed and systematic questions about the system that had produced it. Henderson answered what he knew, and referred the rest to Harlan, whom Carr visited the following afternoon. Harlan gave him the copied pages. Carr read them at the table with his coat still on because it was cold outside, and he had not yet felt the room's temperature stabilize around him. And by the time he finished reading, he had removed his coat without noticing. "This is the floor," he said, looking down. "That's the floor," Harlan said. Carr delivered the copied pages to 3 different communities in 2 counties over the following month, in each case accompanying them with his personal testimony about the warm floor and the warm wall. and the small fire burning with the clean intensity of a system that was working correctly. The information he conveyed had embedded in it an experience that resisted purely practical description, because the warmth of that floor was not merely a physical fact. It was a relief of a kind that people who had spent winters in genuine fear of the cold understood immediately and personally. The copies of the pages spread. The following winter, 3 communities in the next county had Bevan hearths. The winter after that, the design had crossed into Wyoming territory, in the hands of a homesteader who had spent the spring constructing a version in his own hillside, with the plans spread on the ground beside him, weighted at the corners with stones consulting them the way a navigator consults a chart in unfamiliar water. His version worked imperfectly the first winter. He wrote a letter to Harlan Voss describing the symptoms. The draw was inconsistent, producing occasional backpuffing that sent small amounts of smoke into the room. Harlan read the letter at Mara's table and they discussed it together, and Mara identified the probable cause. The tunnel had been built with a slight downward slope, allowing cooled gas to pool at a low point and disrupting the flow. She described the fix. Harlan wrote it back in a letter that was clear and specific and included a small diagram. The homesteader in Wyoming fixed his tunnel. The following winter, no backpuffing. He wrote to tell them so. These letters, the ones that came and the ones that went, accumulated over the years into a small and unplanned archive of the spread and adaptation of the Bevan hearth. They were not addressed to an institution. They were addressed to a woman in a cabin in the Black Hills, and to the builder who had become her collaborator. And they were written in the direct, unsentimental language of people who had a heating problem and had found a solution and were reporting results. Mara kept the letters in a tin box on the shelf above the cots next to the Edinburgh book. She read each one when it arrived, and then she put it in the box, and she did not organize them or annotate them, or do anything to indicate that she considered them a record of anything. They were correspondence. They were the ongoing conversation of a practical community with a practical solution to a shared problem. She was not in any year of her life a person who thought of herself as having done something remarkable. This was not false modesty. She had dug a tunnel and built a firebox and got the physics right. She had done this because her son needed to be warm, and she had no other option she considered acceptable. The same determination that had produced the tunnel had also, at various points in her life, produced a well-dug garden in unpromising soil, and a pair of boots resoled so many times the original leather was only a rumor in the structure. She applied the same attention to all of them. The tunnel had worked, and the garden had mostly worked, and the boots had worked until they hadn't. And all of this was the ordinary texture of a life being lived as carefully and as intelligently as the circumstances permitted. Owen grew. He grew in the way that children grow when their early years have asked something real of them. Not just taller, but more precisely himself, more clearly. The person he had been in outline since he was 7 years old, and carrying creek stones up the path in a wooden sledge. He grew into his father's dark eyes and his mother's jaw, and he grew into the patience that had been his most consistent quality since before he could reliably read the patience of a person who has learned early that the important things take time. and that time spent correctly is not time wasted. He learned to build. He spent his adolescent summers working alongside Harlan Voss, absorbing the craft of stone and timber the way he had absorbed everything else through his hands, through sustained attention, through the habit of watching what worked and understanding why. Harlan taught him how to dress stone, how to calculate a load, how to read the grain of timber for its honest strength. Owen brought to this education the principles his mother had given him, the deep intuitive sense of how heat moved and where mass lived, and what happened in the long, slow conversation between a fire and the earth that held it. He became eventually the person who people asked when they wanted to build a Bevan hearth, and the terrain was complicated or the existing structure presented problems that the standard plans could not solve. He came to these situations the way his father had come to a difficult seam in the mine, with patience, with attention, with the willingness to stay in the problem until the problem showed him its answer. He was 18 when Harlan Voss died in the summer of 1895 of a heart that had been worn down by 30 years of heavy work in difficult conditions. Harlan died in his own house in the room warmed by the Bevan hearth he had built and rebuilt and refined over 11 years in the warmth of a system he had helped to spread across 2 territories in a bed with a warm floor beneath it and a warm wall behind it. Owen helped carry him. He stood at the graveside with Mara, who was in her 50s now, and stood straight in the July heat without assistance. And he thought about the man who had knelt on their floor in January 12 years ago and said one word. He thought about the notebook. He thought about the letters. He thought about all the warm floors in all the houses he had built and helped to build floors that existed because a builder had been willing in the end to set down what he thought he knew and learn something new from a woman he had dismissed. He thought a man who can do that is not a small man. Mara lived another 20 years. She lived them in the same cabin which she maintained with the same attention. She had always brought to things that needed to be maintained and which, with the Bevan hearth running through the hill behind it, remained the warmest house in the settlement through every winter the Black Hills produced. She expanded the garden slowly over the years, claiming more of the thin soil at the edges of the granite, coaxing it into productivity with the same systematic patience she had applied to the tunnel. She traded with her neighbors. She read the letters in the tin box and wrote letters back. She watched her son build things. She did not seek recognition. Not because she was humble in any performed sense, but because recognition was not the thing she had been reaching for when she picked up the pickaxe in August of 1883. She had been reaching for warmth. She had found it. Everything that had followed was the warmth distributed. The evening of the winter when Owen turned 30, Mara stood at the window of the cabin and looked out at the hillsides in the late December light. The settlement had grown. There were more houses than she could count from this window, scattered across the slopes and the valleys, each one its own economy of ear and stone and family. She could see from where she stood the chimneys. Some of them were conventional, producing the full, billowing white smoke of a large fire burning inefficiently. The smoke that rose fast and thick and told you everything you needed to know about the woodpile being consumed inside. And some of them were not. Some of them showed the thin, pale exhaust of a Bevan hearth, the cooled, nearly spent gases of a fire that had given everything it had to the stone and was releasing only its last breath to the sky. You could tell them apart at a distance if you knew what you were looking for. The difference was in the volume and the color and the way the smoke moved. The conventional chimney pumped out a steady, vigorous column, while the Bevan hearth's chimney offered a thin, intermittent thread, barely distinguishable from the pale winter air. She counted the thin threads. Owen came to stand beside her. He was a man now, large in the way his grandfather had been large in the mines, dense with the particular strength of someone who has spent years doing physical work that required both force and precision. He stood beside his mother at the window and looked out at the hillsides, the same way she was looking, following her gaze to the chimneys. He counted with her silently. 14, he said after a moment. I counted 16, she said. He looked again. You're right. The Halverson place. I couldn't see it behind the ridge. He paused. I'm gonna put one in for the Callaways in the spring. Their chimney is the worst in the valley. She nodded. They stood together at the window while the December light failed, and the hillsides went from gold to gray to the deep, final blue of winter evening. One by one, as the light went, the chimneys became invisible, absorbed into the dusk. But the thin threads of pale smoke from the Bevan hearths remained visible a little longer than the rest against the darkening sky before they too disappeared. No names were attached to those threads of smoke. No marker in the settlement identified the origin of the system that produced them. There was no plaque on the cabin wall, no entry in any official record. No acknowledgement from any institution of learning or government authority that the quiet revolution in how these families survived the winter had come from a woman with a pickaxe and a memory of her husband's voice. There was only the warmth of floors that did not require a fire to be burning in order to be warm, the warmth of stone walls that held a summer's worth of heat and paid it out slowly through the long nights of January to the sleeping families on the other side. The warmth of children who grew up not afraid of cold, not because the cold was not real, but because the house they slept in had been built at some fundamental level to be on their side. Mara turned from the window when the last light was gone. Owen had gone to the firebox. He was arranging the wood the way she had taught him, split fine and upright, the configuration for a fast and complete burn. He struck the match with the easy competence of a man who had done this 1,000 times. And the fire caught in the small vertical chamber lit with a clean, concentrated glow. The smoke went forward. It moved into the tunnel without hesitation, without drama drawn by the patient logic of a system that knew its job and did it without requiring anything from anyone. It moved into the stone passage and gave up its heat to the rock foot by foot, all the way to the far chimney on the slope above. And the stone received it and held it, and began in the slow and reliable way of stone to give it back. Mara sat down in her chair by the back wall. The warm wall, the wall that connected their small human life to the ancient geological patience of the hill. She put her hand against the stone palm, flat the way she had stood in August of 1883, on the other side of it outside in the warm evening air, hearing her husband's voice. The stone was warm. It was always warm by now after so many winters of deposit and return. The hill behind the cabin had been receiving the heat of her fires for more than 20 years, and it had accepted every calorie and stored it in its deep, patient way, and it had never failed to return what it was given. It did not know about January. It did not know about the winter of the blue stillness or the walk that Harlan Voss had made through the killing cold with his coat and his shame and his daughter's cough in his ears. It did not know about the letters in the tin box or the 16 chimneys on the hillsides producing their thin, pale threads. It knew only temperature. It knew that it had been given heat, and that it held heat, and that heat moved from hot to cold, and would therefore move from the stone into the air of the cabin, where the air was cooler, and it would do this steadily and without effort through the night, and into the morning long after the fire had gone quiet. This was enough. This was exactly enough. Outside, the winter dark settled onto the black hills with the completeness it had always brought, indifferent and total and vast. The cold pressed on the cabin walls and found no purchase. Found the walls warm enough that there was nowhere useful for it to go. Found the system sealed against it and working against it from the inside. From the deep inside, from the place where the fire's energy lived in the stone. Inside the floor was warm. Inside the wall was warm. Inside a woman sat with her hand against the stone in the last of the firelight. And she did not think about legacy, or recognition, or the 16 threads of pale smoke on the hillsides. She thought about Celine, who had known that the stone remembered. She thought about Owen, who had carried creek stones in a wooden sledge and trusted her without asking to be trusted. She thought about the morning in August when she had stood with her palm flat against the warm granite and understood in the way that certain understandings arrive, not as thoughts, but as certainties that had been waiting for you to be ready for them what she was going to do. She thought, we are still here. Then she stopped thinking and sat in the warmth, and the fire burned low in the small, tight firebox, and outside the dark winter held the hills in its ancient, impersonal grip, and inside the stone remembered, and the earth kept its promise. The world had told her to build a bigger fire. She had built a smarter one. The world had valued strength. She had valued understanding. The world had looked to the sky for its answers. She had looked to the earth and found that the earth, unlike the sky, remembers what you give it. Mara Bevan never sought recognition for what she built. What she sought in August of 1883, with a pickaxe and a dead man's knowledge, and a 7-year-old son watching from the doorway, was simply this: to be warm, to keep her child warm, to survive the thing that was coming by understanding it more deeply than it understood itself. She succeeded. And the question that her story leaves hanging in the cold air of every winter that has come since, the question that every thin thread of pale smoke from every hillside chimney seems to ask of the people who see it, is the same question she asked herself that August evening, with her palm against the warm stone. What are you accepting without question? What problem are you still solving with a bigger fire, when what the situation demands is a smarter one? What granite hill sits behind your own life, dismissed as an obstacle that is in fact waiting to become your greatest resource? What conventional wisdom has been so certain for so long that no one has bothered to test it? Your hill is waiting. The stone is ready to remember. The only question is whether you will pick up the pickaxe